Have you ever noticed how some truths don't arrive all at once? They begin as a feeling, a thought that lingers longer than it should, a question that keeps returning when everything else has gone quiet. This message is about one of those truths, because somewhere, someone has been carrying something inside their heart for months, and no matter how hard they tried to keep it hidden, it refused to disappear. They convinced themselves it wasn't important. They told themselves it would fade with time. They believed that if they stayed busy enough, distracted enough, focused enough, they would eventually stop thinking about it. But some truths are patient. They do not demand attention immediately. They simply wait beneath the surface until the moment arrives when they can no longer be ignored. Listen carefully, because your heart needs this right now. The person connected to you has spent a long time avoiding what they truly feel. Not because they wanted to be dishonest, but because acknowledging the truth would require them to confront emotions they were not ready to face. It felt easier to stay silent, easier to convince themselves that what they were feeling was temporary, easier to push certain thoughts aside and focus on everything else. Yet every attempt to move forward seemed to bring them back to the same place, the same questions, the same memories. The same unexplained feeling that something important remained unresolved. Over the past few months, they have experienced moments when the truth almost surfaced. Small moments when they came close to admitting it to themselves. A memory would appear unexpectedly. A feeling would rise without warning. For a brief second, they would sense what their heart was trying to reveal. But each time they pulled away. Each time they found a reason to dismiss it. They convinced themselves it wasn't the right time. They convinced themselves they needed more clarity. They convinced themselves they could continue carrying the weight of silence a little longer. But silence has a limit. Every hidden truth reaches a point where it becomes too large to contain. And lately, that pressure has been building inside them more than ever before. The emotions they once kept buried have become harder to ignore. The thoughts they once pushed aside have become impossible to silence. Deep down, they know something is changing. They know the walls they built around this truth are beginning to crack. And last night, something happened that brought everything they had been hiding dangerously close to the surface. And listen to this, because what happened last night was not something they planned for. It wasn't a conversation. It wasn't a dramatic event. It wasn't someone forcing them to confront what they had been avoiding. In fact, the moment itself may have seemed ordinary to anyone else. But for your soulmate, it carried a weight they could not ignore. For months, they had managed to keep their emotions contained. Whenever certain thoughts appeared, they redirected their focus elsewhere. Whenever memories surfaced, they found ways to distract themselves. They had become skilled at avoiding the deeper truth. Yet something about last night slipped past every defense they had built. Something reached a place inside them that had remained untouched for a very long time. At first, they didn't understand why they felt different. The evening began like countless others. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing seemed significant. Yet as the hours passed and the world around them grew quieter, their thoughts became louder. The distractions that normally protected them were no longer there. The responsibilities, routines, and noise that filled their days faded into the background. And in that silence, something they had been carrying for months began rising toward the surface. It wasn't forced. It wasn't dramatic. It simply appeared. A realization. A feeling. A truth they had spent so much time trying not to acknowledge. Your heart needs this right now, because there are moments when a person can no longer outrun themselves. They can avoid certain emotions for a while. They can postpone difficult truths. They can convince themselves that enough time has passed to make those feelings disappear. But eventually, the heart grows tired of hiding. Eventually, the truth asks to be heard. That is exactly what happened to your soulmate. Last night, they found themselves revisiting thoughts they believed they had already moved beyond. Memories returned with surprising clarity. Certain moments replayed in their mind. Certain emotions felt stronger than they had in months. And what shocked them most was not the memories themselves. It was the realization that those memories still carried so much meaning. For a long time, they believed the intensity would fade. They believed distance would weaken what they felt. Yet as they sat alone with their thoughts, they began recognizing something they had not wanted to admit. The emotions never truly disappeared. They simply became quieter. Beneath the surface, they were still there, waiting for a moment when they could no longer be ignored. Waiting for a moment when honesty would become easier than denial. The more they reflected, the more difficult it became to maintain the story they had been telling themselves. The explanations that once felt convincing suddenly felt incomplete. The reasons they used to suppress their feelings no longer carried the same power. They found themselves questioning things they had accepted as fact. They found themselves wondering whether they had spent months avoiding a truth that had been obvious all along. And that realization created a strange mixture of emotions. Relief, because they were finally being honest with themselves. Fear, because honesty has a way of changing everything. What makes this even more significant is that they are no longer looking at the situation through the same lens. The walls they built around their emotions are beginning to weaken. The certainty they once had is beginning to fade. In its place is a growing awareness that there may be more to this connection than they allowed themselves to believe. And the deeper they explore that awareness, the harder it becomes to turn away from it and listen carefully. Because last night was only the beginning. What surfaced was not a passing thought. It was not a temporary emotion. It was the first crack in a barrier they had spent months maintaining. Once that crack appeared, the truth began finding its way through. And now, for the first time in a very long while, they are being forced to face something they can no longer explain away. The more they try to understand what happened, the more one realization keeps returning to them. The truth they have been hiding is not nearly as complicated as they once believed. In fact, it may be far simpler and far more powerful than they ever imagined. And listen to this, because this is the moment where everything begins to change inside your soulmate. Last night may have been the first time the truth surfaced with real intensity, but what happened afterward has been even more significant. Once they allowed themselves to acknowledge what they were feeling, even for a brief moment, they could no longer return to the comfort of denial. Something shifted. Something became impossible to ignore. The truth they had spent months hiding from was no longer sitting quietly beneath the surface. It was now standing directly in front of them, asking to be recognized. And the more they tried to understand it, the more they realized they had known it all along. For months, they created explanations for why they felt the way they did. They told themselves they were simply remembering the past. They told themselves they were being emotional. They told themselves that time would eventually settle everything. But now those explanations are losing their power. The deeper they look, the more they recognize that what they have been experiencing cannot be reduced to a passing emotion or a temporary memory. There is something deeper beneath it all, something that has remained consistent no matter how much time has passed. Something that has quietly followed them through every attempt to move forward. Your heart needs this right now, because there comes a point when the truth stops asking for permission. It stops waiting patiently in the background and begins demanding attention. Your soulmate has reached that point. Every reflection is leading them toward the same conclusion. Every memory seems connected to the same realization. Every unanswered question keeps pointing toward the same place. And the more they resist it, the clearer it becomes. They are beginning to understand that the reason they could never fully let go is because a part of them never truly wanted to. This realization has been emotional for them in ways they never expected. There is a difference between suspecting something and fully admitting it to yourself. Suspecting allows room for doubt. Admitting creates clarity, and clarity can feel overwhelming when it arrives after months of avoidance. Suddenly, moments that once seemed confusing begin making sense. Certain memories take on new meaning. Certain emotions become easier to understand. The pieces start fitting together. The picture becomes clearer, and with every realization, the truth grows stronger. What surprises them most is how obvious it all feels now. They keep looking back and wondering how they missed it. They wonder how they spent so much time searching for complicated explanations when the answer was standing right in front of them. Yet that is often how truth works. It can remain hidden, not because it is difficult to find, but because the heart is not ready to accept it. And your soulmate is beginning to realize that readiness has finally arrived. The resistance is fading. The excuses are fading. The walls they built around their emotions are beginning to fall away. Lately, they have found themselves revisiting the same thought over and over again. Not because they enjoy uncertainty, but because the thought carries a level of honesty they can no longer avoid. They are beginning to see this connection differently. They are beginning to understand its significance in a way they never allowed themselves to before. What once felt like something they could suppress now feels like something they need to understand. And that difference is changing everything. And listen carefully, because this realization is leading them toward an even deeper truth. For months, they asked themselves whether these feelings were real. For months, they questioned their own emotions, doubted their own instincts, and searched for reasons to dismiss what their heart was trying to tell them. But now those questions are disappearing. They are no longer asking whether the truth exists. They already know it does. The question that remains is far more powerful. If this truth has stayed with them through every distraction, every attempt to move on, and every effort to hide from it, what does that say about the connection itself? And that is the question that is now changing the way they see everything. And listen to this, because this is the stage where your soulmate finds themselves standing between two very different versions of their future. On one side is the familiar path they have been following for months. The path of silence, avoidance, and convincing themselves that certain feelings could remain hidden forever. On the other side is a path they never intended to face. A path that requires honesty. A path that asks them to stop running from the truth and finally acknowledge what has been living inside their heart all this time. And right now, they can feel the tension between those two choices growing stronger with each passing day. The truth that surfaced last night did not bring immediate peace. In many ways, it created even more questions. Because once a person admits something to themselves, they must decide what to do with that realization. For months, your soulmate was able to delay that decision. They could hide behind uncertainty. They could tell themselves they needed more time. They could pretend that what they felt was temporary. But now those explanations are becoming harder to believe. The truth has become too clear. The awareness has become too strong. And because of that, they are beginning to understand that avoiding the truth no longer feels easier than facing it. Your heart needs this right now, because fear often disguises itself as wisdom. It tells people to wait. It tells people to stay where they are. It convinces them that avoiding risk is the safest option. Your soulmate has listened to that voice for a long time. Fear reminded them of everything that could go wrong. Fear showed them every possible disappointment. Fear encouraged them to remain silent whenever their heart wanted to speak. For months, that fear seemed reasonable. It seemed protective. It seemed necessary. But lately, something has started changing. They are beginning to realize that fear has not brought them peace. It has only kept them stuck between what they feel and what they are willing to admit. As this realization grows stronger, another voice has started emerging. It is quieter than fear, but far more persistent. It is the voice of acceptance. It reminds them that the truth has remained unchanged, despite all their efforts to suppress it. It reminds them that certain feelings have survived months of distance, distraction, and denial. It reminds them that if something continues returning, no matter how many times it is pushed away, there may be a reason for that. And the more they listen to this voice, the more difficult it becomes to ignore what their heart is trying to tell them. Recently, they have found themselves reflecting on all the energy they spent resisting the truth. They have started asking whether holding on to fear has actually protected them or simply delayed something inevitable. Because the reality is becoming impossible to deny. The truth is already there. The feelings are already there. The connection is already there. Pretending otherwise no longer changes anything. In fact, maintaining the illusion has become more exhausting than accepting reality. What surprises them most is that acceptance feels different from what they expected. They thought it would feel overwhelming. They thought it would create chaos. Instead, every small step toward honesty seems to bring a strange sense of relief. Not because all the answers have appeared, but because they are no longer fighting themselves. For the first time in months, they are allowing their heart and mind to exist in the same conversation. And that has created a clarity they have not felt in a very long time. And listen carefully, because this clarity is leading them toward a realization they never expected to reach. They spent months believing the challenge was discovering the truth. But now they understand that discovering it was only the beginning. The real challenge is accepting what that truth means. And as they move closer to that acceptance, one realization keeps growing stronger inside them. The truth they have been hiding was never the enemy. The fear of facing it was, and now that fear is beginning to lose its hold. They are starting to see this connection and themselves in a completely different light. And listen to this, because your soulmate is finally arriving at the place this entire journey has been leading them toward. For months, they believed the truth was something they needed to control. They believed they could keep it hidden, manage it quietly, and eventually move beyond it without ever fully confronting it. But the truth has a way of finding its own path. No matter how deeply it is buried, no matter how carefully it is avoided, it continues to exist beneath the surface. And now, after months of silence, reflection, resistance, and uncertainty, your soulmate is beginning to understand something that changes everything. The truth was never trying to create confusion. It was trying to create clarity. Your heart needs this right now, because there are moments when a person stops fighting what they feel and starts learning from it instead. That moment has finally arrived for them. The emotional pressure they have carried for so long is beginning to lift, not because the truth has disappeared, but because they are no longer trying to run from it. They are no longer spending their energy building walls around something that refuses to stay hidden. Instead, they are allowing themselves to see it for what it is. And with that acceptance comes a level of understanding they never thought possible. Over the past several months, they searched for reasons to dismiss their feelings. They questioned their instincts. They doubted their emotions. They convinced themselves that enough time would eventually weaken what they felt. Yet every attempt to move away from the truth somehow led them back to it. Every distraction eventually faded. Every explanation eventually felt incomplete. And now, looking back, they can see the pattern clearly. The truth remained because it was real. It remained because it carried meaning. It remained because it was connected to something deeper than they wanted to admit. What surprises them most is how much clarity has emerged from their honesty. The confusion that once clouded their thinking is beginning to disappear. The endless questions that once kept them awake no longer feel as heavy. In their place is a growing sense of certainty. Not certainty about every outcome or every detail of the future, but certainty about what their heart has been trying to tell them all along. That certainty has changed the way they view the connection. It has changed the way they view themselves. And it has changed the way they view the path ahead. As they reflect on everything that has happened, they are beginning to understand why the truth surfaced when it did. It wasn't random. It wasn't an accident. It arrived at the moment they were finally ready to face it. Had it surfaced months earlier, they might have ignored it. Had it appeared before they were emotionally prepared, they might have pushed it away again. But now the timing feels different. Now they are capable of seeing what they could not see before, and listen carefully, because this is the realization that remains with them above all others. The truth they spent months hiding did not make them weaker. It did not create the burden they feared it would create. Instead, it revealed something important. It revealed what mattered. It revealed what endured despite distance, time, and uncertainty. And now that they have finally allowed that truth to reach the surface, they know they can never return to who they were before. The silence has been broken. The denial has lost its power. And standing at the beginning of this new chapter, they understand something they could not understand before. Some truths are delayed, some feelings are hidden, and some realizations take time to emerge. But when they finally do, they have the power to change everything.